What was it like to live in Israel when there were no laws, no police, no courts, and no one to stop violence? For centuries, we have imagined ancient Israel as a peaceful, unified nation, walking faithfully with God. But what if that image hides the darkest chapter in their entire history? What if there was a time when mothers barricaded their children inside at sunset, when travelers disappeared on roads between villages, when entire tribes turned weapons on their own brothers? What if survival meant listening through the night for footsteps outside your door, and morning meant counting who made it through alive? When you truly understand this era, you discover that domestic life in Israel once operated under such different and desperate rules that even the simplest stories in Scripture begin to carry completely new weight. Stay until the end, because what you will discover goes beyond historical curiosity. It is a strengthening of our faith today. After Joshua died, something broke. In Israel, the generation that had crossed the Jordan, that had seen Jericho's walls collapse, that had watched giants fall, they passed away. Their children inherited the land, but not the conviction. And their grandchildren, they forgot entirely. The book of Judges records it with devastating simplicity. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This wasn't poetry. It was diagnosis. The land itself made survival nearly impossible. Israelite families scattered across the hill country, clinging to rocky slopes and narrow valleys. Between them lay Canaanite city-states, still unconquered, still hostile. The fertile valley of Jezreel remained in enemy hands. Beth-shean controlled the eastern passages. The coastal plain belonged to Philistine strongholds. To travel from one Israelite settlement to another meant crossing territories where ambush waited in every mountain pass, where bandits watched from caves, where a single wrong turn could mean your family never saw you again. Each tribe fended for itself. There was no central command, no unified army, no messenger system to call for help. The roads, what few existed, were too dangerous for regular use. Merchants stopped coming. Trade collapsed. Information moved slowly or not at all. A village 10 kilometers away might be burning, and you would only learn about it when refugees stumbled into your settlement days later, if they made it at all. This isolation bred something darker than fear. It bred forgetting. Without Joshua's leadership, without the tabernacle functioning as a center of unity, without priests teaching the law, the covenant began to fade from memory like morning mist under the Galilean sun. The stories of Egypt, of the Red Sea, of Mount Sinai, they became tales told by old men, doubted by young ones, ignored by their children. And then the cycle began. Faithfulness collapsed into apostasy. Apostasy invited oppression. Oppression forced desperate cries to God. God raised up a judge to deliver them. Deliverance brought temporary gratitude. Gratitude faded into complacency. Complacency rotted into new apostasy. Round and round, each turn of the wheel faster than the last, each recovery shorter, each fall deeper. But the cycle alone doesn't capture the terror. The pattern doesn't convey what it felt like when darkness descended. To understand how survival actually worked in this chaos, you must first understand what happened when the sun went down, when shadows swallowed the valleys, and when the only sound between you and violence was the thickness of your door. The moment twilight ended, everything changed. The temperature in the hill country dropped sharply as darkness swallowed the landscape. Cooking fires dimmed to embers. The sounds of animals retreating into pens faded. What had been a village in daylight became a collection of isolated fortresses in the dark, each family sealed inside their own walls, listening. There were no street torches, no communal lighting. Fire attracted attention, and attention meant death. The phases of the moon determined whether you could see a raider's silhouette before he reached your door or whether you would only hear the scrape of metal too late. Darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was the presence of threat. Inside, families had already begun their preparations hours before sunset. Wooden bars, thick as a man's forearm, dropped into iron brackets across the door. Stone blocks, shaped specifically for this purpose, were wedged against the frame from the inside. Windows, no more than 45 centimeters across and positioned high in the walls, were too small for a grown man to pass through. But still, fathers checked them, every night, without exception. Sleeping positions weren't chosen for comfort. Everyone pressed against the interior walls, as far from the door as the small space allowed. Men positioned themselves nearest the entrance. Weapons, within arm's reach. Swords if they had them, farming tools if they didn't. Mothers kept children between themselves and the back wall. Rough woven blankets provided minimal warmth. Straw pallets cushioned bodies against the packed earth floor. An oil lamp burned at its lowest setting, just enough to prevent complete blindness if someone needed to move, but dim enough not to show through cracks in the door. The real defense was listening. Families trained themselves to sleep lightly, ears calibrated to distinguish wind from footsteps, animal sounds from human whispers. Children learned from infancy that noise at night could kill everyone they loved. A crying baby was a beacon. Parents conditioned their children to freeze at a whispered command, to control their breathing, to become silent as stone. Outside, predators moved through the darkness with practiced efficiency. Moabite raiding parties crossed the Jordan under cover of night. Midianite bands swept up from the south like locusts. Philistine warriors pushed into the hill country from their coastal strongholds. They knew the terrain. They knew when to strike. They moved between villages, targeting the vulnerable, the isolated, the unprepared. The sounds carried through the night air with terrible clarity. Screams cutting short, the crackle of grain stores set ablaze. Animals being slaughtered, their panicked bleating suddenly silenced. The smell of smoke drifting from a neighbor's compound. And then the impossible calculation every family faced. Do you open your door to help? Do you risk your children to save your neighbor? In a land without law, compassion could doom everyone you loved. Some nights, survival meant doing nothing while evil happened just beyond your walls. Some nights, the cost of righteousness was death. When morning finally came, men emerged cautiously into the gray dawn. They checked for tracks first, looking for evidence of how many raiders had passed, which direction they'd traveled, whether they might return. Then came the count. Which families made it through? Who had disappeared in the night? What crops were burned? What livestock stolen? Whose door had been broken down? Bodies needed burying, fields needed salvaging. And always the decision loomed. Flee to another village or rebuild and hope the next night would be different. Each dawn brought relief, and each sunset brought the same suffocating dread again. The trauma accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer, shaping an entire generation's understanding of the world. Trust died, hope shrank, faith withered, but darkness was only one form of chaos. In daylight, different dangers emerged, not from foreign raiders crossing borders, but from within Israel itself, from brother turning against brother with a violence that made external enemies seem almost merciful by comparison. The 12 tribes of Israel, it sounds unified, like one strong nation standing together, but the reality was 12. Separate peoples divided by geography, dialect, and competing interests. Mountain ranges split them apart. Enemy territories kept them isolated. They spoke Hebrew, differently enough that an Ephraimite literally could not pronounce the word shibboleth the way a Gileadite did. During one civil war, this difference became a death sentence. 42,000 men were killed at the Jordan River fords, identified and executed simply because they could not say one word correctly. The only thing holding these tribes together was a fading memory of Egypt and an old promise about Canaan. Nothing more. When resources grew scarce, when drought withered crops, when disease killed livestock, when grazing land shrank, tribes turned on each other. Water rights sparked blood feuds. Disputed boundaries led to massacres. In a culture built on honor, even a perceived insult demanded payment in blood. There were no courts to arbitrate, no king to impose justice, no neutral mediator to stop the spiral. Only force, only violence answering violence. The tribe of Ephraim nearly went to war with Gideon because he had not invited them to fight alongside him against the Midianites. A bruised ego almost became a tribal war. Later, Ephraim did go to war against Jephthah over a similar slight. Real armies assembled, real battles were fought, real blood soaked the ground. 42,000 Ephraimites died in that conflict, Israelite killing Israelite over wounded pride. But nothing compared to what happened with Benjamin. It started with a crime so horrific it still shocks readers today. A Levite and his concubine sought shelter in Gibeah, a Benjamite town. That night, men from the city surrounded the house and demanded the Levite be sent out to them. Instead, his concubine was thrown outside. They raped her through the night. By morning, she was dead on the doorstep. The Levite cut her body into 12 pieces and sent the parts throughout Israel as evidence of what Benjamin had allowed to happen. Israel assembled. 400,000 soldiers gathered, demanding that Benjamin hand over the guilty men for execution. Benjamin refused. They chose tribal loyalty over justice. They chose to protect rapists and murderers because they were fellow Benjamites. 26,000 Benjamite soldiers stood against the rest of Israel. The first day of battle, 22,000 Israelite soldiers fell. Benjamin won. The second day, 18,000 more Israelites died. Benjamin won again. On the third day, Israel changed tactics. They set an ambush. 25,000 Benjamite warriors were killed, but Israel did not stop there. They went city by city through Benjamin's territory. They burned every town, they killed women and children, they slaughtered livestock, they destroyed everything. An entire tribe nearly erased. When the rage finally cooled, grief set in. Israel suddenly realized what they had done. They had almost exterminated their own brothers. Only 600 Benjamite men survived, hiding in the rocks of Rimmon. No women, no children, no future. The solution they created was just as horrific as the war itself. They attacked Jabesh Gilead because that city had not sent soldiers to fight Benjamin. They killed everyone except 400 virgins, whom they gave to the surviving Benjamites as wives. Still 200 men short, they told the remaining Benjamites to hide in the vineyards during the festival at Shiloh and kidnap the young women dancing there. This was not enemy conquest. This was family destroying family. This was Israel cannibalizing itself. But beyond tribal wars and civil bloodshed, there was an even darker force at work. A corruption so deep it touched the sacred itself, rotting Israel from the inside out in ways that made physical violence seem almost secondary to the death happening in their souls. It took only one generation to move from witness to worship of false gods and just one more generation to complete wickedness. The people who had watched Joshua lead them into the promised land, they saw the Jordan River stop flowing, they saw Jericho's walls collapse, they saw giants defeated by God's power. Their children heard these stories and half believed them. Their grandchildren asked, "What do these stones mean?" As if the memorial markers were curious relics from mythology, not reminders of miracles their grandfathers had witnessed with their own eyes. High places sprouted on every hill like weeds after rain, stone altars, wooden poles carved to honor Asherah, metal idols cast in the shape of bulls. The Canaanite gods promised what seemed more practical than covenant faithfulness: rain for crops, fertility for herds, prosperity for families. All you had to do was perform the rituals. All you had to do was bring the offerings. Yahweh had delivered them from Egypt, yes, but could he make their barley grow? Could he fill their cisterns? Could he give them sons? Faith became negotiable. Worship became transactional. The sacred became seasonal. The altars to Baal stood on hilltops, visible for miles. Stone platforms supported wooden poles and bronze images of bulls. What happened at these altars would have been unthinkable to Moses' generation. Ritual sex with cult prostitutes, literal intercourse performed as worship, bodies offered to secure the gods' favor, drunken feasts with meat from sacrificed animals, ecstatic dancing that led to frenzy, worshippers cutting themselves with knives until blood ran down their bodies, believing their suffering pleased the gods. These sites often stood within sight of destroyed Canaanite cities. The Israelites were worshiping the gods of the very people they had conquered, adopting the practices of nations God had commanded them to drive out completely. Children grew up watching their parents climb these hills, learning these rituals as normal religious practice. Most families did not abandon Yahweh entirely. They simply hedged their bets, worshiping both. Why choose when you could cover all possibilities? Even the judge Gideon had a father who maintained a Baal altar in his own backyard. This was not fringe behavior. This was mainstream Israel. But there was something worse than Baal worship, something so dark it seems impossible that any parent could consent to it. Yet they did, in increasing numbers. The practice of passing children through the fire to Moloch. Archaeological sites preserve the evidence, ceramic jars containing the charred remains of infants. The ritual followed a precise pattern. A bronze statue, shaped like a man with outstretched arms and the head of a bull, was heated in a fire until it glowed red hot. Priests chanted, drums beat in rhythm. Parents brought their infant forward. The child was placed in the statue's burning arms. Drums pounded louder, specifically to drown out the screaming. Priests declared this sacrifice would secure prosperity, guarantee abundant crops, protect the family from disaster. How did parents justify killing their own children? The reasoning followed a terrible logic. Crop failure meant the entire family would starve to death. Sacrificing one child might save the others. And when neighbors were doing it, when community leaders endorsed it, when priests sanctified it with religious authority, the unthinkable became thinkable, normal, expected. Even Jephthah, one of God's chosen judges, made a vow that resulted in his own daughter's death. He promised to sacrifice whatever came out of his house first. If God gave him victory in battle, his daughter emerged celebrating his return, and he kept his vow. The text records no divine command to stop him. No angel intervened. No prophet rose to prevent it. The prophetic office had fallen largely silent during this period. 1 Samuel records that the word of the Lord was rare in those days. When a society sacrifices its children, it has sacrificed its future. The priesthood itself had become corrupt. Eli's sons, serving at the tabernacle in Shiloh, stole meat from sacrifices and slept with women at the entrance to God's house. A Levite named Micah hired out his services to whoever paid the most, treating the priesthood like a business contract. The tabernacle at Shiloh fell into neglect. Eventually, the Philistines would capture the Ark of the Covenant itself, God's presence taken by pagans. The shepherds became wolves, and the flock scattered into darkness. This spiritual corruption did not stay abstract or confined to hilltop altars. It shaped how people treated each other in every interaction. The corruption of worship became the corruption of everything. And when God was abandoned, no one remained to protect the powerless. Without courts, disputes were settled by whoever commanded more armed men. The 6 cities of refuge that Joshua had established, places where someone accused of accidental killing could flee for protection, required central authorities, or to function. Without enforcement, they became meaningless. Might made right. The strong took what they wanted, the weak suffered. Blood revenge consumed families for generations with no legal system to break the endless cycles of retaliation. The gates of cities where elders were supposed to gather and judge disputes became marketplaces instead of courtrooms. Widows and orphans whom the law of Moses commanded Israel to protect became prey instead of protected. Justice was not blind, it was absent. Women had no independent legal standing without a male protector, father, husband, or brother. When men died in war or violence, their widows became property. Their daughters became commodities to be traded or taken. Aksa, given as a prize to Othniel for capturing a city, had to beg her father for water rights after marriage. Jephthah's daughter, killed to fulfill her father's rash vow to God, had no one to intervene on her behalf. The text records her fate with terrible simplicity. She accepted it, asking only for 2 months to mourn her virginity with friends before her father carried out the sacrifice. But nothing reveals the depth of women's vulnerability like the account in Judges chapter 19. A Levite traveling with his concubine sought shelter in Gibeah. That night, men from the city surrounded the house demanding the Levite be sent out. The host refused, but offered his own virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine instead, saying the men could do whatever they wanted with the women. The Levite seized his concubine and pushed her outside. They raped her through the night. By morning, she lay dead on the doorstep, hands stretched toward the door. Her own companion had used her as a human shield, and when he found her body, he cut it into 12 pieces and sent the parts throughout Israel as evidence of Benjamin's crime. Later, after the war that nearly exterminated Benjamin, Israel needed wives for the 600 surviving Benjamite men. They attacked Jabesh Gilead and killed everyone except 400 virgins, whom they distributed as wives. Still 200 men short of wives, the elders told the remaining Benjamites to hide in the vineyards during the festival at Shiloh and kidnap the young women who came out to dance. Scripture records this without comment, as if abducting girls from a religious festival was a reasonable solution to a tribal problem. In a world without law, women were not just vulnerable. They were currency. Children fared no better. Most did not survive to adulthood, claimed by war, famine, or disease. Boys grew up watching brutality and were trained to perpetuate it. Girls were valued for bride price, not personhood. Orphans had no state care, no adoption system. Survival meant begging or slavery. Boys as young as 12 or 13 were expected to fight, and archaeological evidence confirms the existence of child-sized armor from this period. When Gideon's youngest son Jether was too afraid to kill captive enemy kings, he was shamed for his weakness. Childhood was not a protected stage of life. It was preparation for brutality or death. Yet even in this darkness, there were exceptions. The book of Ruth opens with the words, "In the days when the judges ruled," placing her story directly in this era of chaos. Ruth, a Moabite widow with no protection in hostile Israel, experienced kindness from a man named Boaz. He allowed her to glean in his fields, protected her from harassment, and eventually married her, redeeming her from poverty and vulnerability. His actions were extraordinary precisely because they were so rare. One righteous man protecting one vulnerable woman, this was revolutionary in the age of judges. And through Ruth came the lineage of David, and through David, the line that would lead to the Messiah. God preserved hope through chaos, and a thread of redemption continued even when everything seemed lost. But all this chaos, the violence, the apostasy, the suffering of the innocent, was driving toward something. Israel's darkest era would birth their most desperate cry for change, and in that cry, the true meaning of these terrible centuries would finally be revealed. When you read Judges again, you are not reading ancient history. You are reading a mirror held up to every generation that forgets God, every society that abandons His law, every human heart that insists on choosing its own way. The Age of Judges asks one question that echoes across 3,000 years into our present moment. What king do you serve? And if this documentary strengthened your faith and expanded your understanding of Scripture, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Your support allows more people to discover the history that sustains the Christian faith and walk with deeper conviction in a world that still struggles between chaos and the call to follow the one true King. Until the next video.